We'll be continuing on Chapter 15 of Barry and the Boys, the CIA, the Mob, and America's Secret History by Daniel Hopsicker. Did Barry Seal fly a getaway plane out of Dallas? On the afternoon of November 22, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was murdered. Several hours later, David Ferry's friend Lee Harvey Oswald was captured by the Dallas police. At about 1 p.m. that same afternoon, half an hour after the president was shot, neighbors who lived along the road that runs by Reed Bird Airport near Dallas began calling the police to report a private plane behaving particularly. For an hour it had been revving its engines, they reported, not on the runway but parked at the end of the airstrip on the grassy area near to the fence. The noise prevented nearby residents from hearing their TVs as news came over about the terrible events in downtown Dallas. Shortly hereafter, the plane took off. An FBI file on March 10, 1967 describes statements made by an air traffic controller, Louis Godin, on duty at Red Bird at the time. We tracked Godin down in retirement in the tiny town of Long Beach, Texas, and coaxed him into speaking for the first time about the shocking events he had witnessed. I filed that report in '67 for only one reason, Godin said. I received a visit from an assistant attorney in Jim Garrison's office, who showed me 4 pictures of possible pilots involved in the incident that day. One of them was a weird-looking character with a funny-looking wig. A week later, I saw him on the news. They said his name was David Ferry, and he had committed suicide. That's when I smelled a rat. I was an air traffic controller working in the tower at Redbird that day. When I came on shift, I was told we'd received a bulletin to report any suspicious activity immediately to an FAA security number. And we did. We kept calling that number all afternoon, but all we got was a busy signal. Then, when we heard they had caught the lone gunman, I guess they called it, we stopped calling and let the matter drop. And that's where the matter rested until Godin became alarmed at the death of a man whose picture he had just been shown. He called the FBI and filed a report which he said because something of a burden to him for the rest of his life. There was no Freedom of Information Act back then, he says today. That is what's created some problems for me. From his perch atop the control tower, Godin had noticed something suspicious about 3 well-dressed men in business suits standing alongside several suitcases beside the Comanche painted green and white. He grew so suspicious, he related that when the plane took off on runway 17, he asked the pilot if he needed any assistance to establish contact. The pilot said no. Godin then asked which way the plane was heading. The pilot stated south. Godin watched as the plane flew south for 2 miles, made a hard left and flew north toward Love Field. The pilot had lied. Suspicions now fully arose. He went to the control tower's receiver and listened as the plane made an approach and landed at Love Field, 8 miles north of Redbird. What happened later clearly indicates that Godin witnessed something he had no business seeing. From the control tower, he says, he was too far away to be able to identify the people aboard the plane. But there was one person who could, Merritt Goebel, who ran the fixed-wing Operation Texair at Redbird Field. Merritt and I were friends, Godin relates. So one day after filing the FBI report, I went down to see if the FBI had been visiting him too. They hadn't. He told me I asked him if he had anything. I asked him if he had anything. Gas receipts or any record of the fueling of the airplane in question. And he acted very strangely and told me it was none of my business. He said, I will only answer questions from bona fide law enforcement authority, and that I've always thought was real strange because, like I said, we were friends. Merrick Goebel died last year, taking any secrets he possessed to his grave. But Redbird Field was not just a small general aviation airport, according to a native Texan former CIA pilot Gary EDL, who owned a facility who owned a facility there in the 1970s. The FAA had its general aviation headquarters there. Howard Hughes had a huge old World War II hangar there with heavy security, people from Wackenhut all over the place, and there were the Porter planes from General Harry Byrd's outfit. Was Barry Seal at the controls of that suspicious Comanche? Did he own a Comanche like the one drawing suspicion at Redbird? And even without a picture of Seal with the CIA assassination squad Operation 40 taken in Mexico City on January 22nd, 1963, based on evidence and given a government at all interested in solving the crime, it is clear that Seal, at the very least, should have been considered a prime suspect in an investigation into that suspicious looking getaway plane. A spectacular pilot, a known associate of all the usual suspects, David Ferry, Carlos Marcello, Guy Bannister, and Grady Parton. One more on him later. Seal, a gun runner to Cuba, a veteran of the Bay of Pigs, and a CIA pilot, was never questioned in the protracted and indifferently motivated investigations to follow. And this is highly significant. Barry Seal was protected. Lacking an eyewitness both willing to come forward and enough of a survivalist to live to testify, the truth of that day in Dallas will never be completely known. We believe Seal did indeed fly that getaway plane out of Dallas, and this fact remained his ace in the hole for the rest of his life during his often acrimonious dealings with his superiors. For the purposes of history, it appears indisputable to us at this time that Garrison got it mostly right. Back in the coup, central New Orleans, Oswald's arrest must have been received as horrifying news to Ferry and Carlos Marcello, who would otherwise have been celebrating their triumph over Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department that very day in the federal courthouse. Not a live Oswald was a scream. Now a live Oswald was a screaming patsy. So that evening, Ferry rushed off into a blinding thunderstorm in his car with two young male companions to Texas to go ice skating. He says, "This is a clumsy and implausible lie." Ferry probably was coordinating the finishing of the job. We can all certainly imagine what a cop would say if any of us used that line. Tell it to the judge. Do people drive all night through blinding rainstorms right after the murder of their blood enemies to ice skate? What other reason might there be to explain why FBI and Secret Service showed such disinterest in Ferry as an assassination suspect? If their investigations were controlled by the coup plotters themselves, they would have acted exactly, we think, as they did, in fact, act. And we are left with the chilling certainty that the rulers of the present republic shot their way into power, just as Hitler's Nazis did. Some have said that Ferry's mission to Houston and Galveston was to himself fly a getaway plane, hooking up with the plane from Redbird and then continuing overseas. Raymond Brashears, a roommate of and friend of David Ferry, told writer Dick Russell, David went to meet a plane. He was going to fly these people to Mexico and eventually to South Africa, which did not have an extradition treaty with the United States. They left from some little airfield between Dallas and Fort Worth, and David had a twin-engine plane ready for them, and that was the purpose of his mad dash driving through a driving rainstorm from New Orleans. Redbird Airport is a little airfield between Dallas and Fort Worth. Brashears sounds as if he got the story just a little garbled in translation. Sam Gianca later confessed to participation in the assassination, stating a plane load of killers were flown to the Texas border, according to his brother Chucky Gianca, in Double Cross. From there, they were supposedly driven to a mob hideout in Monterrey, Mexico, where Gianca himself hid out after slaying. In addition to the well-known suspects, Chucky says, Momo said that two of the hitters had been Santos Traficante's friends, one a crooked former barista cop, Felix Rodriguez, and the other U.S. Customs officer. The noose began to tighten around David Ferry less than 48 hours after the assassination. One morning of November 25th, an FBI teletype said Ferry's library card had been found on Oswald when he was arrested. Savvy Dale knew he was hot and stayed away from New Orleans until the following Monday, when he was interviewed by the FBI, the Secret Service, and the New Orleans police. Transcripts of these interviews were Natch, immediately classified. They were never mentioned in the FBI's summary report and were not turned over to the Warren Commission. Following the theory that the most likely suspects are the people who should have been considered the most likely suspects, if this weren't Casablanca, deserving special scrutiny today should be Felix Rodriguez, unquestioningly one of the CIA's most successful assassins. In 1959, Rodriguez was a top cop in Cuba under Batista. When Batista fled to Miami, Rodriguez went with him along with Frank Sturgis and Chichi Quintero. Officially, Rodriguez didn't join the CIA until 1967, well after the CIA investigation of Cuba in which he participated and the assassination of JFK. But records recently uncovered how he actually joined the CIA in 1961 when he was recruited by a certain fella named Bush, which is, Rodriguez says, how he became such a close personal friend of Bush. The Nation magazine discovered a memo written by J. Edgar Hoover on November 29, 1963, summarizing oral briefings given on the day after the JFK murder to, among others, Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency. Rodriguez and Bush share another bond. Neither remembers where he was when Kennedy was shot. Rodriguez, asked by a Rolling Stone reporter where he was the day JFK was shot, claimed he couldn't remember. And on the day of the assassination, George Bush was in Texas too, but he denies knowing exactly where, and Texas is an awfully big state. In plausible denial, Mark Lane, arguably the dean of assassination researchers, reprinted the Nation article in a book detailing his successful defense of the Washington-based Spotlight newspaper against charges brought by E. Howard Hunt. This puts Rodriguez and Bush in company with a few select others who can't recall where they were when Kennedy was shot. Richard Nixon and Howard Hunt, both of whose stories changed so often as to be embarrassing to anyone with a decent regard for tradecraft. Nixon, Hunt, Rodriguez, and Bush, not the disappeared ones, the forgetful ones. Was Bush CIA as far back as 63? When the question came up in his presidential campaign, Bush had the White House stonewall the matter, but it has been reliably reported with the CIA since 1961 using Zapata oil as cover for agency activities with anti-Castro groups before the Bay of Pigs. CIA agent David Atlee Phillips should also be called in for questioning. Now that he's dead, it's probably even almost politically feasible. Author Anthony Summers found a deposition of Howard Hunt in which he answered a question concerning the radical anti-Castro Cuban organization DRE with which Oswald was associated in New Orleans. Hunt said, "The DRE, Dave Phillips ran that for us, but that is classified, I think. He was the head of it. The administration clearly links Oswald's activities in New Orleans to Phillips, and the CIA also to Dallas. the DRE safe house in Dallas, the gun running involved Jack Ruby, and the Renegade training camp, which the CIA denies existed on the shores of Lake Pontchartrain, a place so top secret that film taken there of Lee Oswald, David Atlee Phillips, Guy Bannister, and David Ferry had to be stolen from the House Select Committee. The question always arises how a conspiracy so vast and intricately planned and involved so many people could possibly have been kept secret all this time. It is usually phrased like this: why hasn't anybody talked? The answer is simple: they have. The talking started before the assassination and has continued to this day. Carlos Marcello bragged in front of Ed Becker that Kennedy would be killed and described how it would be done. Santo Traficante Jr. stated Kennedy would be killed. Joseph Miltier, a right-wing nut, said Kennedy would be killed and even described how it would be done. Johnny Roselli, Sam Gianca's right-hand man, told Jack Anderson that Ruby, their man, was ordered to silence Oswald. Lyndon Johnson's mistress, Madeleine Brown, said Johnson implied before Kennedy was killed that it was going to happen. Marita Lorenz, CIA agent, relative of Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge and mistress of Fidel Castro, said under oath that she was with Frank Sturgis, Felix Rodriguez, and a group of anti-Castro Cubans present at the Kennedy assassination. Even David Atlee Phillips, alias Maurice Bishop's perpetrator of the multiple Oswalds, said before he died that fringe elements of U.S. intelligence may have been involved in the conspiracies. Sam Gianca, Homer Echevarria, and many more not mentioned here, because this book's focus is not on any one single atrocity, but on the team to which Barry Seal belonged, the boys, and their amazing 40-year-long crime spree. The American Embassy in Mexico City housed the largest CIA station in the Western Hemisphere in the 1960s, home to the CIA assassination squad dubbed Operation 40. Mexico City was where a photographer immortalized Barry Seal and his CIA mafia cohorts in a picture taken in a nightclub on January 22, 1963, in the company of Frank Sturgis, CIA operative William Seymour, and Felix Rodriguez. David Atlee Phillips, aka Maurice Bishop, was the CIA's covert action chief in Mexico during 1962 through 1963. When this picture was taken, reliable testimony has him meeting with Oswald in Dallas before the assassination. In Deadly Secrets, authors Warren Hinkle and William Turner name Raul Villaverde, Rafael Chichi Quintero, Los Posada Carriles, Felix Rodriguez, Frank Sturgis, and Ricardo Chavez as members of Operation 40. Joaquin Sanguinis directed Operation 40 until his death under the overall control of Howard Hunt. Thomas Clines, the notorious Edwin Wilson, and blonde ghost Ted Shackley, Mr. Spook himself, were all involved with Operation 40. Frank Sturgis, member of the team that broke into the Watergate complex in 1972, admitted to having been part of Operation 40. So was Barry Seal. Yeah, Barry was Op 40, Gerald Hemming confirmed to us. He flew in killer teams inside the island, Cuba, before the invasion to take out Fidel. Richard Nixon is generally given credit for planning Operation 40 during his 1959 campaign for president. After Batista was kicked out and Castro came to power, American corporations which Castro nationalized, Pepsi, Ford, Big Oil, the syndicate, asked Nixon to put the hex on Fidel. Nixon started planning Operation 40. It's him all over. CIA Colonel William Bishop told author Dick Russell about Operation 40, showing him a series of photographs of Latin-looking individuals. On the backs of pictures were the words Special Talent 1960 through 65, Ice Pick Man, Butcher, Sniper, and Demolition Expert, Propaganda, Knife Man, pilot and navigator, mutilator. Bishop said, "We weren't playing a nice game." Russell wrote that on some of the pictures were inscribed Destino Mexico and asked whether this meant that these particular people had operated out of Mexico. "Yep," said Bishop. "A lot of times they would cover their tracks by declaring themselves as nationals of Mexico or Nicaragua, Panama. It didn't make any difference." In The Man Who Wasn't There, Russell wrote that Bishop conceded that he had been in Mexico City 2 or 3 times in 1963. When Russell asked about his purpose there, Bishop replied that he would rather make no comment on that, saying it was a matter of national security. "It had something to do with Cuba," Bishop said, "but not as such." When Chuck Gianca discussed mob boss Sam Gianca's strategic move to Mexico in early 1963, he touched on Op 40. It was to be an all-out, no-holds-barred Latin American push. Mooney settled into a lavish Mexico City apartment and went right to work, dawning on the expertise and mammoth resources of the recently formed CIA team of assassins and operatives specifically trained for Latin American clandestine operations. CIA insiders jokingly dubbed the team the White Hand, an allusion to the mafia killer progenitors, the Black Hand. In March through April 1962, SEAL associate Gerald Patrick Hemming was approached by Guy Bannister, he says, to assassinate John Kennedy. Hemming said he turned him down, saying, "Are you fucking crazy?" Bannister is also implicated by Cuban General Fabian Escalante, CIA Colonel William Bishop, FBI and CIA documents. Hemming said Colonel Bishop worked for Gerald Magruder of military intelligence too, just like the CIA William Harvey. Harvey worked both sides. He worked in direct contact with Sullivan and Hoover while he was on the CIA payroll. A lot of these people had different loyalties because back in World War II, they'd excluded OSS from the Western Hemisphere. So it was the FBI guys that had all the intel when CIA and INR and the State Department picked them up. In this description fits Barry Seal's recruiter, David Ferry, who played in South America during World War II. The central thesis of most researchers on the assassination is that the work of the mafia elements of the CIA and right-wing Cuban exiles aligned with Guy Bannister, Clay Shaw, and David Ferry, all whom were CIA connected. Jack Ruby was Sam Gianca's man in Dallas for years, running guns for the CIA as well. He had demonstrated loyalty and the ability to work with both groups during the planning for the Bay of Pigs invasion. Ruby had friendships with undercover agents, with men like Oswald, and even offered David Ferry a job in his carousel club. So it is logical that it was Ruby who was ordered to silence Oswald, and Barry Seal knew them all. But the most persuasive evidence that Barry Seal was in on the hit came 9 years after the assassination, when he and 6 others were on trial for attempting in 1972 to send 7 tons of plastic C4 explosives to anti-Castro Cubans in Mexico. In the middle of the trial, the judge received an anonymous letter threatening to blow the cover off matters pertaining to national security unless the charges are dismissed. Its contents, reprinted here in full, reveal a bald attempt to blackmail a federal judge into dismissing felony charges by convincingly demonstrating first-hand knowledge of the Kennedy assassination. Exactly the same threat Nixon tried to use to get the FBI to call off the Watergate investigation. Though the letter is anonymous, the envelope bearing it is in Barry Seal's handwriting. "Dear Mr. Lestage, due to personal initiative and desire to see justice done, this letter is mailed to you and your associates. The United States two-count indictment against seven men on charges of conspiracy to ship implements of war out of the United States without having approval of the government has no chance to succeed. In the years 1956 and 1957 and 1958, I worked for the C.J. Simpson de Cuba Drilling Company, which had 3 rotary drilling rigs operating in Cuba. Whether you or any of your associates are aware of the number of implements of war shipped by that company out of the United States as components for drilling equipment, I have no idea, but I advise you to find out. These shipments of implements of war by the CIA had no known open approval of the United States government. Yet I am sure that your attitude towards it would be that as long as it is done by a federal agency, it is correct. If this is your assumption, then you are dead wrong. I can name names of agents involved in these shipments. The whole sorry mess of the CIA putting Fidel Castro into position to overthrow the government of Juan Batista has never been told to the public. An open court of law would be a fine place to bring truth of this entire matter out. My testimony to this affair of 1956, 1957, and 1958 as being relevant to the government's case against these 7 men cannot be repudiated. As you can see, this letter is unsigned, and for good reason. Copies of this letter are filed with a number of people, you are herein advised that mention of this letter will be made in the effort to squash the 2-count indictment against the 7. If you have any reply, hand carry your reply, open and not sealed, to Lee Young of Alexandria Bureau of the Shreveport Times, who will in turn deliver it to me signed. Former Liaison Officer C.J. Simpson de Cuba, a 45177. What was this about? Lee Young cannot, 27 years later, be found, but C.J. Simpson de Cuba can. In a Secret Service report from Chicago about former C.J. Simpson de Cuba employee Homer Echevarria, it stated Echevarria had foreknowledge of the assassination. The incident was found particularly disturbing by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, especially given that it had come to the attention of Secret Service within days after John Kennedy's death. The memorandum reported a tip from the informant that a Cuban activist, Homer S. Echevarria, in a discussion about an illegal arms sale, said that his group had plenty of money and his backers would proceed with arms deals as soon as we take care of Kennedy. When the Secret Service investigated Echevarria, they discovered that his father had been a pioneer of the oil industry in Cuba, and that he had left Cuba in 1964 Miami and then Dallas, where he worked for the C.J. Simpson Oil Drilling Company. In a Secret Service report after the assassination, an informant reported that he had knowledge of a group of Chicago Cubans allegedly anti-Castro who were bitterly opposed to President Kennedy, including Cuban exile Homer Echevarria, who was connected with DRE and the 30th of November movement, who learned from Paulino Sierra that President Kennedy was going to be assassinated prior to November 22, 1963. For the information of all offices concerned, the Secret Service reported Mosley advised on November 26, 1963, that he had been attempting to negotiate a sale of machine guns to one Homer S. Echevarria, and that Echevarria allegedly made a comment the day before the assassination of President John F. Kennedy that we now have plenty of money as soon as we or they take care of Kennedy. In the estimation of Maurice G. Martineau, acting special agent in charge of the Secret Service office in Chicago, it had been a hot lead. A reliable informant, Thomas Mosley, had told one of his agents the day before the assassination that a Cuban exile with whom he had been negotiating the sale of machine guns had boasted his group now had plenty of money and would make the buy as soon as we take care of Kennedy. In an urgent communication to headquarters, Martineau advised he was undertaking a top priority investigation from what Echevarria disclosed. He learned that the arms deal was being financed by Paulino Sierra's provisional government with money obtained from hoodlum elements who were not restricted to Chicago. The House Select Committee discovered that the organization run by Paulino Sierra was financially backed by organized crime. It would have blown the case wide open. Martineau prepared to place an undercover agent inside the Echevarria group, and expanding investigation would have uncovered the Sierra cabal link to the Lake Pontchartrain camp, the mafia, and the Castro assassination plots, which in turn would have opened a Pandora's box of leads to Ruby and Oswald. But after LBJ ordered it to assume primary jurisdiction in the JFK case and the FBI effectively choked off the investigation, the Bureau made clear that it wanted the Secret Service to terminate its investigation, said the House Select Committee. When the Secret Service complied turning over its files, the FBI chose not to pursue the matter. Less than a week later, newspapers across the nation were reporting an exhaustive FBI report, now nearly ready for the White House, will indicate that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone, unaided assassin of President Kennedy. One of the three so-called Dallas tramps, Chauncey Holt, testified that Homer Echevarria was supposed to have been his contact in Dallas when Kennedy was killed. And the two exile Cuban groups with Echevarria worked, the DRE and the 30th of November movement, were the same groups using the CIA's renegade training camp on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. Evidence was surfacing within just a few days of JFK's assassination of networks of militant Cubans and mafiosi, and with connections to Lee Harvey Oswald involvement in gun running to Cuba, with one of the Cubans even bragging about taking care of Kennedy before the assassination took place. Homer Echevarria, with foreknowledge of the Kennedy assassination, worked for the C.J. Simpson Oil Drilling Company. And 9 years after the JFK assassination, Barry Seal is pointedly referencing this same obscure company, C.J. Simpson, in an attempt to blackmail a federal judge into dismissing his indictment. Seal was using the same threat Richard Nixon tried to use to wiggle out of Watergate, knowledge of that Bay of Pigs thing. Finally, we turned back to writers Sally Denton and Roger Morris, from whom we had first heard a rumor of Barry Seal's involvement in the Kennedy assassination. When we inquired where they had first heard it, we learned from author Sally Denton that her father had been Mike McClaney's lawyer. Small world. We'll pick up chapter 16 tomorrow.